I had grown so disenamored, fed up with all that fakery of such drugs as ecstasy. I came across cocaine, which I felt very smug about, very complacent about cocaine. I felt, I'm never going to get hooked on cocaine. It's such a shit drug. And I did. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror. I would have these fights with myself in the mirror, like proper split personality episodes, cussing and cursing and just really hating my own reflection in the mirror. Stop thinking that everything that comes out of your brain is the truth, because actually you will find further down the line that much of it isn't.
Hello and welcome to 12 Steps and 12 Questions. My name is Silvio and I'm an addict. This pod is full of personal and inspirational stories of recovery from addiction. And in every episode I'll ask each guest the same 12 questions about their life, addiction and recovery. Quick warning, there will be some graphic descriptions and a healthy amount of swearing. For this episode, please welcome Fabrizio. Hi listeners, welcome to this new episode of 12 Steps and 12 Questions. Just a quick reminder, 12 Steps and 12 Questions is not substance or behavior specific, and I welcome all 12 steppers. And please rate and review the show, it really does help to spread the message. Enough of that, let's get to our guest for today. I'm so glad he's here. Fabrizio, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Fabrizio and I'm an addict. And today I've been 1,500 days clean, which is about 4 years, 4 weeks and 4 days, I think. It's my, third time around. I came into recovery 25 years ago. Is that 20 years ago. And 12 of those I spent clean and sober by the grace of God. I'm a member of CA and CMA, but I call CA my home fellowship.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Fabrizio. I'm a man of words and not numbers, so I can't verify any of the maths. But I'm sure you've got that covered. In any which way, it's great to have you here, and it sounds like you've got quite a few stories to tell. So let's get started with the first of the 12 questions. The first question is, Fabrizio, did you have any adverse childhood experiences?
So my memories of my childhood are actually relatively happy. However, my father did leave before I was even born. And I do remember quite clearly that I somehow felt responsible for that. Because I must have heard it said, children are very intelligent. And as the adults talk amongst themselves, they think they're not being heard or understood. And actually, I gather that, and I remember praying every night on my knees that my father might come back. Not because I particularly cared for my father, who I hadn't even met, but rather because I was made to feel, although they hadn't realized that that's what they were doing, as the culprit.
Yeah.
Which I wasn't, by the way. He'd already met somebody else, but obviously my, my forthcoming birth kind of accelerated the process of him leaving, put it that way.
Yeah. Let's pause here for a second. I find this very interesting in that there is events as they unfold, right? As far as we can sort of call them facts. And then there is, things that we take away from them, the message, sort of sometimes even hidden message that we take away from those events, particularly when we're children. We don't have the full view of things, as it were. So am I getting this right, that you found out later that your father had met someone else? That's what you just said. And he was on the way out, quote unquote, anyway. Is that what happened? If we're just looking at the facts?
Yes, in a few words, that's what happened. And he really, really, really didn't wish for me to be born. And much later still, had I found out that actually attempts were made to not make that happen. this is something that I actually was told much later in life, which was actually quite traumatic because I had no idea that had gone on.
Yeah, and it is clearly a difficult experience. And what I'm hearing as well is that what you took away, sort of alluding to where we came from in our conversation, slightly circling back, is that you took away that you were the culprit, which isn't obviously true, but this is what we take away, isn't it? Those messages.
100%. And I always felt like I wasn't meant to be there. I was redundant somehow, you know. Although my mum loved me, she really did. Don't get me wrong. But perhaps because I had an elder sister, you know, the two of them both being female, obviously there was more rapport, camaraderie. You know, it was different. So I always felt a little bit like the odd one out, you know.
Do you know, this cuts a bit closer to the bone perhaps than I expected, in that my father was quite an absent father, only in that he worked, you know, I don't know, 2-3 jobs, and, you know, was very much a sort of provider, very 1950 sort of a setup, if that makes sense. And my mother and my sister, I also have a sister who's older, would always talk amongst themselves. And I'd be sort of, I don't know, if my sister was maybe, 13, you know, with sort of pubescent, and I was like 9, and I would get all these messages about what men do, what they're like, this, that, and the other. And I absorbed, unwillingly in a way, but I absorbed all of these messages, and they weren't exactly helpful in my journey to become a man, and how I related to my own being a man. And so I can really see and hear what you're saying, which is that there is the facts on the one hand, and then there's the message that we take away from those facts, and how those things that happen anyway in the household can really affect you deeply.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, the whole thing was exacerbated later during my puberty and my realization of being gay. And so that created yet an extra layer of separation, right? So, yeah.
Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that? You know, because I'm assuming that this must have been quite a difficult time for you.
Oh, it was very difficult. I mean, we're talking about Rome in the 1980s, you know. This is not London in 2025.
No. Perhaps we should very quickly then circle back to Rome in the 1980s and talk about how, well, basically homophobic the place was.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, I was picked on at school, and you know, I never particularly in recovery. I actually considered many times how this being bullied is a bit dishonest, actually, because I bullied myself, and so I realized that in recovery, also doing step 4s and things like that.
Yeah.
You know, so yes, I was bullied, and because I was different, not necessarily because I was gay. I mean, I hadn't even come out. Obviously, I was 11 or 12, right? It didn't help that my mum made me wear such far-fetching headgear as a Sherlock Holmes hat that they bought in London, or a Davy Crockett one, which was fur with a tail behind it. You know, like I didn't stand out enough. They got me to wear that sort of gear, you know.
Oh dear. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously I remember Italy in the 1980s, and I do remember that it was a lovely place and loving place in many, many ways. But I also remember it that, you know, being different, and particularly I remember my father, for instance, you know, if we're talking about this, he was extremely homophobic, you know, and any idea that I happen not to be gay, but, you know, that even if I even dared to look the other way would have been, oh my God, you know, it was unthinkable, really. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it was a blessing in disguise that my father wasn't there, because it would have been way harder for me later on to come out or any of that. You know, my mom, as a mother, she turned out to be actually unexpectedly understanding over the years. It was a very slow and gradual process, don't get me wrong, but nevertheless, she did a 180, you know, which I'm very grateful for, and I really commend her for, actually, particularly given her background, which was very conservative, Catholic, and all the rest of it, you know? So you can easily yourself.
So both my parents are Italian from the Molise region, which is the forgotten region of Italy, but I grew up as a boy. I grew up in Germany, and then we had the classic Italian diaspora story. You know, we had the entire family was in Italy, so we migrated back down to Italy for 6 weeks every year. Spend time there, and then we'd go back. And I was the classic kid who left, the third culture kid who was not Italian but not German either, and that hasn't really changed much. So I know the place well. All my relatives and the family dynamics and everything was very Italian. We spoke Italian in the house and all of that. So it was a loud household, doors banging, yelling, all of that. On the one hand, on the other hand, it just happened to be located in Germany. So Our question 2 is, what did the moment you first got hooked, the fun times, what did that look like? So here you are, you're this kid who has taken away this message from your childhood that somehow you're unwanted. You feel, and you are to a degree even objectively marginalized. And at some point, a behavior, a drug, alcohol, something comes into your life that leaves a lasting impact. The first times usually are quite good. That was at least my experience. It's not everybody's experience. But talk to us a little bit about that, about how you were introduced to things.
So, as for many people, I started drinking rather than drugging. And I would have been about 15 or 16. And I can't say that they were great experiences. I've always drunk in a very kind of sad kind of way. I drank, I would get drunk and I would puke. I couldn't hold my drink. I would vomit every time. I would get really depressed. It never really helped, alcohol. And then I started smoking pot a few years later. So I would have been about 19 or 20, just after I finished school. And I guess that made the difference, actually. That's why I felt hooked, to be fair. I consumed alcohol in an abnormal way. I'm going to be honest. Right. So I suppose I was hooked on alcohol, absolutely. I mean, there were periods when I would get drunk 4 or 5 times a week. I would drink on my own. It was kind of an escape to change the way I felt. Absolutely, but I've never really enjoyed it.
It's funny how we do this, right? That we would. I had a similar story with pot where I would continue. Between the ages of basically 15 and 20, I was stoned every single day. And I didn't like it much. It was a bit giggly, and then but that was it. And then the rest of it made me. I always say this: it made me numb and dumb, right? It just kind of stunted me in some sort of way. But I kept going back to it because I had no other availability, and nothing else seemed to be available. Yeah. Does this sound familiar?
To a degree. Mm-hmm. To a degree, it did numb me. So in Italy, we smoked hashish. So it's much more numbing. It's less psycho-effective, I suppose.
Yeah, it was hash for us as well. Yeah, absolutely. But did that sound similar to your alcohol experience?
No. I loved smoking pot. Compared to alcohol, I loved smoking pot. Because
but you also drank.
Okay. Yeah, because it made me not bothered. I wasn't bothered. Mm-hmm. So I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel shame. I didn't feel inadequate. So I could walk into a bar and just be there in the corner, giggling at, laughing at other people, what they were wearing or whatever it was. And so I wasn't concerned with what they might think of me. Because I never felt I fitted in. Even when I discovered the sort of gay nightlife in Rome, which was very limited, but, there was one. It was very much like, at least as far as I remember it was very much like either you were a fashionista or you were a body fascist. And I was neither. Well, I never felt I fitted in. I thought I'd found, I'd come home. And actually, I had very quickly the realization that even there, I was the odd one out. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't until I actually moved to London a few years later, 1994, just over 30 years ago, that on the London scene, which was by far way more inclusive and diverse and eclectic and all the rest of it. That's when I really felt I'd arrived, actually. Because I never felt judged for my looks or for what I was wearing or anything like that. And the weed was much better, by the way. I loved smoking weed, especially the first, years really, but especially the first few weeks, stroke months, because obviously I hadn't made any friends. And weed was my friend. And I was able to spend time in my little bedroom in Vauxhall, listening to my music, smoking pot. And I felt like some kind of, fledgling rock star in the making, So I'm in London, now look at me smoking pot. I felt, but I didn't last very long. So I was very against, by the way, I was very, very against Class A's.
Right.
Yeah, very against them. I remember my arguments were, you line in the pockets of the mafia, of the gangsters, you shouldn't do that. So even my friends that did cocaine hadn't told me for many years. They would take it, hiding from me, in secret, which is very interesting.
Was this just part of a stoner ethos? I remember there was a stoner ethos at the time where it's okay to be green and smoke weed and stuff. It's natural. It's all sorts, it's you're not sort of lining the pockets of cartels around the world or wherever, and so on. There's less blood up your nose, all of that, right? Was this part of your stoner ethos?
I'm sure there was an element of that. Absolutely. So I felt somehow superior, because it was natural and whatever. But you know what? I lasted about 3 months. That's as long as I lasted before I started taking Class A's in London. Don't get me wrong. I'd experimented with Class A's back in Italy already. I'd already taken my first ecstasy. I tried cocaine 2 or 3 times at least. I'd done acid. This was all in Italy in my early 20s. So I suppose I was a bit open-minded to it at the same time, right? Yeah. But it was cocaine in particular that I had a problem with. When I referred to the, cartels, etc., it was cocaine. And I always said, people that take cocaine, it makes an idiot just a bigger idiot. That wasn't the word I used, but, for the purpose of not offending.
I love how we have... being opinionated is such a thing, isn't it? And you don't have to be an addict for it or anything like that. It makes me chuckle. It still makes me chuckle in my everyday. I still have, I always say that I have to use the sweetest words, so don't mind them eating them later. Yeah. Because well, that's what it's like when you have big opinions. So. Were this at this time that you were discovering yourself, you were discovering life as it could be, you move away to London. I know what that feels like. There's this sense of, Bill Wilson's story, had arrived and all of that, right? So there's so many similarities there, I suppose. And were you aware that one, drugs were already playing a really large part in your life, no matter which ones there were really? And two, how some of it was already perhaps problematic, that you were trying to change the way you feel, that, as you were saying, weed was your best friend, which is a sad statement, really, Were you aware of any of this, or was it just a good time, I'm out there, I'm discovering things?
Was I aware of that? I don't know that I was, actually. I flew to London stoned out of my head, right? Because we got stoned with my mates who drove me to the airport. And I got stoned in London the evening I'd arrived. I was already able to find somebody through my landlord who delivered weed to our place. He was a friend of the SEALs, by the way. I'm sure they won't mind me saying. Just a random trivia. But you know what I mean? So he would come. His name was Michael. It doesn't matter, really. He must be in his 70s now. And he would come to the house and they would deliver the weed. It would make me occasionally paranoid just because I was so lonely. I'll admit that. But as long as I was at home with my music, I was quite happy, actually.
Right. Okay, great. So our question 3 is, what were your worst consequences and finally your rock bottom? Now, obviously we're covering a big sort of chunk of time here. So let's just talk progression,
Yeah.
really, and how it sort of started becoming problematic as it does over time, So how did that manifest?
So, as you said, it's very progressive. And I had already had an inkling that I might have a problem as far back as 1999. I remember asking my flatmates, do you think I'm an addict? So I think that was the first inkling that maybe I had a problem, because I felt I'd lost control more than I had wished to do. Okay.
And what were you using at the time?
So at the time, I was using a wide range of substances, especially ecstasy, ketamine, amphetamines, weed. Obviously, that was omnipresent, and it was really taking its toll. And my behaviors were increasingly erratic. And
what did that look like?
Well, I mean, it won't come as a shock to anybody, perhaps, but I was very promiscuous, and
more so than you wished.
Yeah. I didn't wish to be. I know it sounds really, cheesy, perhaps. I was always chasing the one. That was my thing. I was always chasing the one, And obviously with drugs like ecstasy, which was a very potent drug, as anybody who's ever tried it will know.
Oh, yeah.
It had the ability to get you really connected to somebody, pick up on whatever was the common denominator with the person you were with, and create this really convincing scenario and delusion that actually you found each other. That's your soulmate. And week after week, I would believe that lie. I mean, if I think about it now, it's quite extraordinary, And that went on for, a good 5-6 years until I read.
It's a long time.
Yeah, it's a very long time. This we're talking week in, week out, sometimes multiple times a week, in actual fact. Because often I had jobs that allowed me to do that. And then fast forward to 2005, when I first came into recovery. At that point, I'd started taking cocaine. I had grown so disenamored. Is that such a word?
Sounds good.
Fabulous. So that's our new word for today. Disenamored. Well, I was so bored and fed up with all that fakery and falsehood of such drugs as ecstasy. And meanwhile, I moved into my house, and I felt now I had to behave like an adult. I came across cocaine, which I felt very smug about, very complacent about cocaine. I always felt I'm never going to get hooked on cocaine. It's such a shit drug, pardon my French. And I did. And I thought that I'd arrived. Now I'm an adult. I'm 30, 31. I got my own place. I can entertain my guests. We can take cocaine at home in my living room. And there was that. And that went on for 2 or 3 years, quite intense.
Let's pause here for a second. There is not an unsurprising amount of similarities, but there is so many things there that I'd like to pick up on. Certainly, I went through a very long ecstasy phase. I went through promiscuity phase. I went through a phase where ecstasy created that particular bond with one person over an extended amount of time. And it was very confusing because, you have the special bond with that person, this, that, and the other. But then the moment, the drugs wear off and all the rest of it, it's not like we didn't have anything, but it was different and it was real and it was all sorts, and it's an extremely confusing time that I could not unpick and couldn't unpick for many years after. Actually took a little while, quite a long time really to do that. And then once I started using cocaine, it had a similar thing. I was under underestimating the power of cocaine because it didn't give me that extreme high that you get from amphetamines, the ecstasy in particular, right? On ecstasy, everything, your body, the breathing changes, everything is just so intense, right? And people will notice you're high. With cocaine, I thought, well, this is it's like a half ecstasy kind of a thing, you're feeling a bit up, but that's it. And I underestimated, just like you were saying, everything's a bit more bourgeois. People can come to the house. Everything's a little bit, less chaotic. And then you start thinking, oh, I can handle this.
Yeah.
But you can't.
Completely what you said. Cocaine gave me that high, gave me that kind of drop of inhibitions, sort of uninhibited, but there wasn't that overwhelming, loved up elation that was afforded by ecstasy. And so I felt, under the respect, much more in control. And also, for me, it was always very kind of mechanical. I, at that point, had so enough of, trying to get to know somebody, to no avail, to know there was nothing afterwards. At that point, I wished to not communicate to them anymore. If somebody got really chatty on cocaine, I would show them the door. I was not interested. So those kind of encounters became increasingly cold, actually, as far as I was concerned. But the control, I lost control more and more because I needed cocaine so badly that I was, willing and prepared to literally go to any lengths, and especially I've learned in recovery to get it. And that was my first rock bottom, when I realized, I was in a cab in the middle of the night with an address scribbled on a piece of paper, and I didn't know where I was going, who I was meeting. And I thought, this can't go on. This is just not okay, So that's when the real, I think, self-hatred started developing, and I was completely baffled, and I guess I had a moment of clarity. It wasn't sudden, though. It was not sudden. I called an ex of mine that had moved to Portsmouth, and he was in recovery, and I knew because he told me about it the year before. And I called him, actually convinced that I was calling him to find out how he was. And when he asked me how I was, I burst into tears unexpectedly. He said, "How are you?" Because the way he said it, "How are you?" And I just went, So he invited me over to Portsmouth. Excuse me. I went along, and he took me to my first 12-step meeting.
Lovely. Let's pause there for a second. And let's consider two things. One, we'll talk about our question 4 in a second, but you said that you'd come into recovery at this point, but that in your recovery, you've gone a bit forwards and backwards, is what I'm hearing, right?
Yeah.
In that you came to the rooms, but you didn't stay clean right away. It took you a little while, and then you perhaps relapsed as well, is what I thought.
Oh, yeah.
From what you were saying, yeah. So let's pause that for a second. Let's first go to our question 4, which is, at your worst, right? Now, whether that was already when you were in the rooms or still outside, but at your worst, did you ever want to die? Did you consider suicide?
Yes, especially the last time around, which was 4 years, 4 weeks and 4 days ago.
Right.
I'd become so befogged, and so I was convinced I was chronically depressed, and I prayed God to take my life and considered taking my own life. And I think that was the first time, but it might not have been. But that's the one I remember, perhaps, because it's the most recent. But yeah, absolutely, suicidal thought. I had suicidal thoughts. I didn't make suicidal attempts, but I did think about it. I did think the world would be a better place without me in it. I did think that my family would be better off without me. There was the delusion of my latest, active addiction spell. I became convinced that actually I was so so negative for the people around me that, I should go.
This intense self-loathing that addiction can produce it's very difficult to explain, I think, perhaps to people who've not experienced it. And I say this every time, or almost every time, but I will say it again, dear listener, if this is where you're at right now, if this sounds very familiar, if you're feeling these feelings, if you're thinking your family is going to be better off without you and all the rest of it, please seek help. There is help. It doesn't have to be this way. We talk about it because this is where our addiction takes us, but we don't stay there. Please do something about it. Help is available. The number of the National Suicide Prevention Helpline is in the show notes, and just speak up to anyone or anything.
I would say don't believe the lies that your head tells you.
Yeah.
Stop thinking that everything that comes out of your brain is the truth, because actually you will find further down the line that much of it isn't. A lot of it is not, and it gets really dark. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror. I would have these fights with myself in the mirror, like proper split personality episodes, sort of cussing and cursing and just really hating my own reflection in the mirror.
Yeah, I've had similar episodes, and it's very, very disturbing. Absolutely. Our question 5 is, what other methods did you try to get sober before finding the rooms? If you're enjoying this podcast and would like other addicts and alcoholics to hear it, then please make the pesky AIs and algorithms work their 12th step. Hit like and subscribe.
I did try to get sober before finding the rooms. I especially remember it must have been around 2004, 2005, so literally a few months before finding the rooms. I did something called the Landmark Forum.
Oh my God. I did the Landmark Forum. Yes. Okay.
Right.
Right. We need to explain this to the listeners very quickly. I'll try and have a go. A Landmark Forum, I don't know if it still exists or not, is a 2 or 3 day course, I think one could say, where they aim to transform the lives of the participants who attend, basically. And it's a crash course, I think is fair to say, of life coaching techniques and that sort of thing, right? Something along those lines? Well, help me out.
Yeah. I mean, as far as I remember, they kind of merged and used elements of modern psychology with elements of Oriental philosophy, Buddhism, and things like that. And the gist of it is that they encourage the participants to look at the traumatic experiences in their own life and realize that they belong to the time when they happened, and so to leave them there. Yeah. And actually, there is kind of an analogy, I find, in a way, with the 12 steps, in that you have to resolve those traumas. You have to resolve those resentments by ways of contacting the person that made you resentful or hurt you. Yeah. You hurt them, and so on and so forth. So actually, under that respect, I've got kind of a fond memory, because it was the first step into, I think, adulthood. Actually, and taking stock of what had been some of the traumas in my life that I'd never acknowledged before, never mind resolve. So, and then, I didn't continue the Landmark Forum for reasons that are not important.
Yeah, just to finish painting the pictures of the Landmark Forum for those listeners who have not attended, the thing is that as opposed to the rooms, you're sitting there in a hall really with, 40, 50, 60, 80, 100 participants. Nobody knows anyone from Adam, really. And, you do these exercises with people you've never seen before, talking about resentments that you have, trauma that you've experienced. So everybody after an hour or so is in absolute tatters. There's little guidance, and you're sort of being just sent out to well, call your dad, in my case, and, and say, well, I have some sort of resentment and so on. It's an unguided step 9 in some ways, I think, or that's what it felt like. I don't want to trash it, but I have to say that I found it exciting to begin with. I had the same experience as you. I wanted to change things. I knew there was something wrong with me, and I wanted to change it. But I felt that the way it was done, there's not to say that there wasn't any good things about it. There were, but the way it was done and things I felt was quite, well, it was very intense and all in a weekend type thing.
No, you're quite right. I mean, describing it as a crash course is probably the very best description. It is a crash course. So with all that comes with it, there is no sufficient insight or preparation. Absolutely. But, as far as I was concerned, like I say, I've never done any such thing before. I mean, they do ask people to refrain from taking drugs for the entire long weekend or the duration of the course. And guess what? Of course, I smoked pot. I was always going to smoke pot, So, yeah. So there was that. And then 12 Steps happened approximately a year later.
Right. Okay. Did you try any moderation at all?
No. I tried once. Literally, I tried once. And I lasted a month. And it was horrible.
Yeah.
For the entire month. This was about weed, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I was taking anything else that month. Probably was. But this was specifically about weed. And I managed to stay off weed for a month. And it was awful.
Yeah.
And also, there was moderation, albeit not decided by me when I worked for London Transport. So for a couple of years, I wasn't supposed to be taking drugs at all because they would, they would conduct random drug tests at the stations. And so again, I found a way around it. So what I did do, I stopped smoking weed after, a quick research that suggested that actually chemicals only stay in the body for a few hours and weed is the one that stay in the system the longest. So I thought in order to be safe, I'm going to have to stop smoking weed. But whenever I had a long weekend, I would go out raving.
Right.
And then became increasingly complacent over the course of the 2 years. And then when I was finally kicked out, not for drugs, ironically. They never found out that I took drugs, by the way.
Right.
And the first thing I did, I lit up a massive spliff.
Yes.
I was so resentful that I was made to not smoke weed, which is ridiculous because, nobody forced me. I applied for the job. I should have been grateful. That job allowed me to get my mortgage, by the way. But I only had resentment.
Yeah, the lack of gratitude and finding resentments, which is the exact opposite of what we do in recovery, is striking. Absolutely. Yeah. Our question 6. Did you struggle with the word God when you came into recovery?
I don't think I did. No, because even before recovery, I always fancied myself as a bit of a spiritual person. I had chanted before, I had my little Buddhist prayer books and things like that. I've done Buddhist meditation a number of times. So I wasn't completely adverse to the idea of spirituality. Had this been something related to a specific religious denomination, that would have put me off. I don't think I would have stuck around. I was very anti-religion 20 years ago. I'm not suggesting that I'm not necessarily now, but I've become much more,
Dare I say tolerant?
That's it. That's the word. Yes, I'm much more tolerant around.
The unspeakable word. Yes, indeed. It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because when you come from I suppose our backgrounds are quite similar in that respect. So everything was, full of Catholicism and pictures of Jesus, Madonna, and everybody, and not the pop star, and all the rest. Yeah. Lining the walls. Italy has all these. Now Rome, of course, slightly different place, of course, but still, that once a year, bones of saints and things are carried through in these processions. They're carried through villages and parts of bigger cities and things. So there's a huge the first word that comes to me is burden, but maybe tradition is the better word. But that is the way I felt about it at the time. And of course, my great mistake was to think, also because the book has it's a book that's come out of a Christian movement, so obviously it has some Christian overtones. That rubbed me the wrong way, as I've said on here many times. And so because I felt that I had to find my mother's God, the Christian God, Jesus, really, you didn't have that. You were a bit more advanced than me, is what I'm hearing, because you had already sort of found some spirituality. So had I. But when I came into recovery, I thought I had to find that God. You didn't have that misunderstanding.
No, I wouldn't say advanced. Maybe I was just lucky that I met people from, in my early recovery who really explained to me that, in particular, my ex, actually, I should give him credit. Adam, if you by any chance maybe listening to this at one point, I've not spoken to him in years, unfortunately. I'm very grateful to Adam. And Adam was one of those people that reassured me, because he really wanted to sell it to me, bless him. So you can use your own conception of God. It can be a double-decker bus. Well, no, forget that. It can be a double-decker bus. I say, it's not going to be a double-decker bus. What are you talking about? But, that kind of brought it home for me. The idea that I could, in fact, build a bespoke idea of God for myself. And later still in recovery, a few years down the line, also somebody mentioning the acronym Good Orderly Direction, which really appeals to me. And I often use with my sponsees in case they're struggling around the concept of a deity, of a God. Just think of a good orderly direction, which is exactly what was lacking in my life. There was no goodness, there was no order, and there certainly was no direction.
Yeah. It's a wonderful acronym and a wonderful way in, as it were. I needed that. I needed a little step ladder as well. For me, it was good. So just add the O.
Yeah.
Because even at my worst moments, I would and could believe and saw that there is good in this world, apart from all the bad and all the, but what about, the chapter to the agnostic speaks about it, doesn't it? We looked askance at this world of warring tribes and so on and so forth. and that is exactly the way I felt about it. But even with that, I would always see that there is good in this world. And that was my little step ladder, if you will, to sort of find my way towards a higher power, really. So, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Fabrizio. Our question 7. How do you experience your higher power today?
So my experience in the higher power today manifests itself in whenever I'm able to find acceptance, which I always pray for, around things that don't go my way, which happens regularly, and it still interferes with my life, with my emotions. I still get frustrated, particularly when I feel that somebody wronged me in some way. But I've become increasingly able to turn the other cheek. Not always do I do that. Don't get me wrong. So I will still retaliate sometimes when I feel that I've been not just wronged, but also treated really unfairly. So I can still retaliate. However, there's been recent instances when I actually go up to people and apologize to them, which is really novel for me. Apologizing to people that I don't really care for, colleagues that I see around once a week. I don't work in an office, that's why. I see around, once a week, I meant once a year. So people that I don't even see regularly, it would be so easy to kind of, get away with not.
Yep.
And I believe that the higher power put this person in my path. This was earlier in January. So one morning we were at the same meeting point, working for the same, I'm a tour guide, by the way, just in case, working for the same agency. And there was a few of us waiting for different groups. And this lady pulled me up on the fact that although I had the board with the name of the company, the meeting time was not specified. And my instinct was to say, and I was very dismissive and not very pleasant. I said to her, well, this is the printout of the board they emailed me, darling. I can't believe I darlinged her. I mean, there's nothing worse. I always darling people, but in a good way. Like if it's I'm a strong believer in the context and the intentions. If it's a female cab driver and you've had a nice chat and you're getting off her car and you say, thank you very much, darling, is one thing. But when you're trying to be dismissive and put somebody down, obviously that's a different thing. So you can use the exact same word, but with completely different intentions. So I was very dismissive and I was quite rude, in actual fact. Anyway, I later realized the importance of having the time displayed along with the name of this company, because we all start at different times. So for the client to be able to identify the correct guide, obviously it's very helpful to see, oh yes, that's the 905 tour as opposed to the 855. And I believe my higher power put it back in my path 2 days later. I don't see this person very often at all. And 2 days later, I saw her inside Westminster Abbey, which kind of helped because obviously it's right. It's a place of worship, and she was there. She stood there, and both our groups had gone to see a chapel that you can't guide in. So I was able to approach her, and I decided to approach her, and I said, "By the way, are you an apology?" And as you can see, I've edited my board, and now it displays the starting time. And you were right. And that made me feel so good, actually, that I was able to be as grown up as freaking,
Good orderly direction, manifesting right before your eyes. Yes, absolutely.
100%.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny how simple acts like this have quite a connotation for us, don't they? And because they don't come easily to us. So it's a great way of sharing what your experience is with your higher power, and one example of it. Our question 8, which parts of the steps were the most difficult for you?
Well, first of all, there's a few in reality. I think step 3, handing over. Yeah. The handing over is still something I still struggle around it today. Because I keep multiple times a day, I keep trying to take my will back.
Yes.
And follow my urges and my instinct and my wants. And so I have to constantly hand it back over when I'm lucky. Not always do I succeed, by the way. Make no mistake. I'm trying to be brutally honest here. We don't become perfect people in recovery, but we strive for being decent, half decent. That's what I always say, half decent human beings.
Which sounds like a low bar, but it really isn't.
It isn't, exactly.
No, I hear that.
It's a very high bar if I look back at 4 years ago. So
step 3 then
definitely step 4, seeing my part in things.
It's brutal.
Initially I thought, oh, that's great. Yeah, he did that and she said that and they so now looking, what do you mean looking about? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
They found me, they wronged me. What's my part? I couldn't believe that I played a part in each of these resentments. And actually, this time around, because like I said, I had several recoveries, we can go into it a bit more later if we got the opportunity. This time around, somebody told me, Fabrizio, there are some resentments where actually we did play no part. He said, I was abused as a child. What part did I play? I played no part, right? Yeah. I was vulnerable. I was taken advantage of. My part, I identified, was hanging on to that resentment for 30 years. So we always played a part. It might not be contemporary to the resentment, but we always play a part. Be it small, be it major, and that's the point of the step to look at your part, however small it might be. And obviously the amends. Actually, the amends somehow they weren't as difficult as other things, other aspects. I mean, they are difficult. They are difficult. The amend is easier said than done. Actually, no, sorry, it's easier done than said. So the thought of the amend kind of cripples me. But actually, when I make the amend, somehow it's always been easier than I anticipated.
Plucking up courage to do amends is a big deal, you
Yeah.
know. And then it's one thing talking about it with your sponsor and making a list and things, you know, but then making that call, right, and then sitting opposite that person,
Yeah.
you know. But it is an extremely powerful and freeing thing to do, of course, and that's why they're there.
Yeah. And the legal amend is not difficult per se, but it's something that I'm acutely aware of. I know that whatever I might have said as a way of an amend to somebody would have been completely pointless had it not been followed by appropriate actions and behaviors after. And so, 4 years down the line, I've regained the respect and the affection of my family. But the one-off amend, wouldn't have done that.
Yeah. It's true, isn't it, that an amend in and of itself, just first and foremost, doesn't necessarily clear the whole thing, you know, unless you stay sober and, you know, you become what you just coined a wonderful term of being a half-decent human being. And people can see that there has been a change in you, that you have become someone else, and that you have got rid of these terrible qualities that, you know, have led you to becoming an addict and then were sort of powered by, you know, your addiction. I don't think that the amend itself really, unless followed by this action, necessarily makes all that much difference. That's quite true.
Yeah, you become present, you become accountable. They can see that you're consistent, you're not erratic anymore. You know, I was a loose cannon. And then I was surprised when people felt apprehensive about my going over to Italy for my mum's 80th. Of course they were. No, I expected the red carpet. Completely oblivious to what I had done and said the time before. Kicking up, you know, fights and, you know, just really being really an angry person. And, you know, people remember. And they will consider you somebody not to be trusted, somebody unpredictable, a loose cannon, as I said, you know. So it takes a long time to suture?
Yeah, why not? Suture the wounds?
Yeah, to suture the wounds and to amend literally what you've done in the past. So they won't just buy it just because you said it. Oh, I'm all right now. I'm in recovery. I've not used for a number of months or whatever. Good for you. You know, but now they're all waiting to see what's next.
Yeah, and how you react in certain situations and things, particularly if you within the family construct, you know, it's a particularly powerful context in which these things happen, you know. The famous saying, Ram Dass's famous saying that if you think you're enlightened, go and spend a week with your family, you know, that really comes to bear in those moments, you know, because of course it's the people we have the biggest history with, and perhaps probably the people we've hurt the most. So that's really where those things come to the fore. Absolutely. Our question 9: which character defects give you most trouble?
Pride, ego. I would say pride and ego mainly. Absolutely, pride and ego. Ego more than pride, actually.
How do you define? It's one of those words that gets kicked about quite a bit. It means a lot of things to different people. How do you define it? What do you mean by that?
So ego is an inflated sense of self for me. Okay? So I've got a big ego and very low self-esteem, which is a really unfortunate combination.
It really is.
Right? And so I always find ways to massage my ego, to find validation. And I need to catch myself when I try to do that. And not always do I stop myself from doing it, but still, even in recovery, I can engage in behaviors that are purely aimed at getting the praise and the validation of others. But I should know better, but it still is one of my main defects of character. It really is. and it stems from insecurity, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Question 10. What is the best thing recovery has given you?
Oh, God, the list is endless. It really is. I would say number one, freedom. I walk a free man. That's what my sponsor says. I love that expression. So simple and it's so to the point. I'm walking a free man. I come and go as I please.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds ridiculous and it sounds almost, you should be able to take that for granted. I didn't in active addiction. That's the point. I did not do that. I couldn't come and go as I pleased. I couldn't. Because my life revolved around drugs. Okay? So everything was dependent upon when I was getting the next hit, where I was going to be able to use, where I was going to get the money. There was complete lack of freedom. But that's why they call it bondage, Yeah. To begin with, I think I grossly misunderstood what they might have meant by bondage of self. Actually, it's a great way of describing this complete lack of decisional power. I had no decisional skills. So I couldn't decide what to do or where to go. It was all down to the drugs and the events, and I would just be swept away. It was horrible, complete slavery. It really was. Yeah. And other things that I'm immensely grateful for that I only experienced in recovery and that are completely gifts of recovery are things like increased clarity. Nothing was ever clear. Increased honesty. I fancied myself as an honest person. I really thought I was honest. Because I told it like it was. That made me feel honest. That's not honesty, that's bluntness. It's a big difference. But I lied to myself about everything, actually. And even that sense of being inadequate, for example, even that is dishonesty. It's an askew perception of one's own reality. When you're in active addiction, everything is tainted by your using.
The delusion is incredibly profound.
Yeah.
And even if you make, I mean, we talked about Landmark Forum, but there's other bits, for instance, in my own story, I had more therapy than, is good for any one man, I suppose. But, and I'm not trashing therapy. I was very glad that I had it, but, I had quite, but I, also sort of started meditating and things. So I was I was a spiritual seeker at the same time as also being an addict, right? They're not necessarily, they are mutually exclusive, but it doesn't mean just because you're doing one that you can get rid of the other, and at least not without a program. And so what that meant was that even though I was making strides, right, and I was trying to help myself, and I've had other guests on this pod who went through similar experiences, and I think you did too. As long as you're using and as long as you're drinking, and if you're an addict, it's all to no avail, really, right? You might make a bit of progress here or there. And of course, it's no seeking really is ever lost, but you're not going to get any clarity at all. You're not going to get anywhere unless you stop drinking and using. That was the same. It was also true for my therapy, for instance. Of course, if you're going to your therapist and, you're sort of not being honest and, you're not really talking about the elephant in the room and so on, well, it's not going to do anything.
No, and as many books on spirituality that you might read, as much meditation as you might practice, as you said, as long as you're still using, you will still be unable to follow through.
Yeah,
because you'll still be disconnected from yourself, disconnected from other human beings, and also the utter self-involvement and self-obsession. It was all about me. I didn't care for other people. Right? It was all about what I could get out of a person or a situation. And I couldn't even see it. Just because I was being gracious, not always, by the way, but I had the inclination to be graceful and sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Pleasant, funny sometimes, welcoming, and a lot of people remember me as a nice guy. So maybe I was on a number of occasions, but as nice as I might have come across, I always had my ulterior motives. And that makes another huge difference between active addiction and recovery. Today, I don't have ulterior motives. Today, I actually phone people up just because. Today, I remember people's birthdays. Today, I am able to send them little gifts out of the blue for no reason. Cards for Christmas. I mean, all these things, again, some of your listeners might find them completely ridiculous and basic and can take it for granted. But believe you me, if you've ever experienced addiction, those things are not to be taken for granted. In fact, they just don't happen. Normalcy is not part of addiction. We don't do normal.
No, we certainly don't. We call it the madness, do we not?
Yeah.
Question 11. What would you say to a newcomer or someone wondering if they're an addict? Let's also bring in the fact that you have come into recovery on a few occasions, as you said yourself, and you've relapsed a couple of times. So with that in mind, and with the knowledge and experience you've gained, how would you address this? What would you say to a newcomer? What would you say to someone wondering if they're an addict?
So there are two different questions. So I will address one at a time. Oh God, I'm sounding like Zelensky. I will. So the first one is, if they're wondering whether they're an addict, I won't be able to help them. They are the only person, you are the only person in a position qualified to self-diagnose. Nobody else is in your mind. Nobody else knows what goes on behind closed doors, how much you use, in what way you use. If you use alone, all these things, how it makes you feel, how depressed it makes you feel, how hopeless it makes you feel. I don't know these things. So I would have to ask so many questions before I come to any kind of conclusion, but I'm not an expert. I can only be an expert of my own experience, of my own addiction. So if you're wondering whether you're an addict, that's why sometimes they give you that questionnaire with 20 questions or however many, right? Because it does help, actually, So yes, I use on my own. Yeah, of course I use on my own. Hello. Sometimes I prefer to use on my own, not having to deal with people, because I was so shut off. And also think of the etymology of the word addiction, which literally means lack of choice, lack of say. I have no say in the matter. If you've ever felt that you had no say into whether you were going to use or not, there is a good possibility you might be an addict. But once again, you're the only person able to establish that. In terms of recovery, and I'll come to the second part of the question. In terms of recovery, make no mistake, this is a program of action. It sounds trite, but it is what it is. And so, unfortunately, my experience teaches me that I am not able to practice these principles out of recovery, by which I mean, if I don't work the steps, if I'm not sponsored, if I don't carry the message onto the newcomers and meetings and so on, if I'm not active in recovery, the knowledge, awareness, and memory of the 12 steps is completely and utterly useless.
Yes.
Okay? So this is not a program you learn and then you go on your merry way. That's not how it works. I would like nothing better than to be able to say, yes, that's how it is. Come to a few meetings, attend for a year or however long, and then you're cured. No, I'm recovered for today. Recovery, you take your life back. That's what recovery means. I'm taking my life back for today. But I'm not cured. And my addiction can manifest itself in a number of ways, even in recovery. But in recovery, I'm more able to see it coming, to address it, hopefully. I can be unspiritual in recovery. I can move away from a spiritual life. I can do things that are quite questionable in recovery. I'm not a saint, okay? But in recovery, I stand a much better chance at resolving those things, talking to a sponsor, which is not always easy, you know. I mean, he's lovely. You can tell him anything. It's not about him. But it's not easy for me to always get honest about things that, frankly, I'm quite embarrassed about, particularly after 4 years of recovery, you know. But that's the way it is. It's not linear. So don't expect things to just go perfect once you there's nothing to get permanently. It can be permanent on a daily basis. It's a daily retrieve, you know.
Thank you. And our last question, our question 12. What do you want your higher power to say to you, quote unquote, at the pearly gates?
Oh, lovely, sir. I didn't think of this one, actually. He's probably going to say something on the lines of, "Oh, you're quite the character, aren't you?" You know? I'm really dearly hoping he might say something way more original. And if he's a higher power, I'm sure he's going to come up with something way better than that.
Yeah.
But I'm very worried that he might just say something like, "You were quite the character, weren't you?"
You being quite the character has made this a really, really wonderful conversation. I could keep chatting to you all day long. I have to say that the way we interact and the Italianness of some of this, you know, has sort of led me to be a bit louder, I suppose, and interrupt a bit more than I usually would. But, you know, these things roll the way they do, and that's great, you know. I ask this to everyone whose first language is not English, whether they have interacted with recovery, the 12 steps, and the book in their first language, so in Italian. Have you or not at all?
No, actually, I had a sponsee recently who lives in London, by the way, but his English is not really up to scratch. And, you know, the big book can be quite complex, never mind that it was written in America in the 1930s. So we did try to find an Italian version of the AA book, but it looks like it's quite difficult to get hold of, by the way.
Right.
Now, as far as I'm concerned, I always done it in English.
Right.
But I've got to be very honest. At the beginning, there were things that I just went along with. Do you know what I mean? I didn't fully understand everything. I mean, even now, now I understand all the wording, but there are still figures of speech and metaphors and things. The book still reveals itself to me every single time I open it. And I'm doing a book study with my sponsor on a weekly basis, you know, really deep into the nitty-gritty, historical facts and all the kind of trivia. And it's a beautiful, beautiful book, and it's so well written. You know, I love the imagery, things like the impending sense of calamity. You know, because that's exactly how I felt throughout the last few years of my active addiction. You know, this impending sense of calamity, that something really bad was about to happen. You know, and I was so fortunate to be able to drag myself back into recovery, because my last relapse was 5 years long, nearly. You know, so it's progressive. The first relapse was a one-off. The second one was for about 6 months. Then I had yet another relapse after 2 years of recovery, which lasted a year. Then I was in recovery for 4 years, and I went back out for 5. So that's what I'm trying to say. I hope I've learned my lesson. I can't move away from recovery. I can't do it alone. I like to believe nothing more, you know, nothing better than I can do it on my own now. I've got the tools, I've got the book, I've got the principles, I've got a faith.
I've got it sorted.
I need to pass it on. That's where it's at. You know, you pass it on, because that gives you, going back to the half-decent man, some sense of empathy and humanity, which was grossly lacking in my active addiction. Recovery makes me do that. It teaches me how to do that. And initially, it's a means to an end. it can be kind of selfish because you say, well, we keep what we've got by giving it away. So in order to keep it, I'll give it away. Is it genuine? Is it authentic? It doesn't matter. Just do it. And then eventually you will develop an authentic sense of empathy, because who better to empathize with than your fellow addicts?
Yeah, and this is, of course, where all the things that you listed earlier, all your quote-unquote shortcomings, all those things that you've struggled with, all of a sudden become a gift for someone else. You couldn't make it up. It's that beautiful, Well said. Thank you so much. I noticed recently, and I went, and I was in Germany, and of course, I learned German when I was in school and things. And so I got the book in German for the first time. And what you notice sometimes is that if you back translate things, so obviously I'm a linguist by trade. So this is, is that the word that they use, for instance, for self-seeking, süchtig, that means if you back translate it, it means addicted to self. So by going through different, which essentially is the whole program in, one word, right? The whole problem in one word. And so therefore by, sometimes a different language will offer a different way in. It will offer you different ways of looking at things that you hadn't thought of before, which can be quite powerful. But of course, that's the nature of things. Sometimes things get quite literally lost in translation. So you might lose a few things. So I'll close this episode by saying the Serenity Prayer in Italian, because I think it's an apt thing to do, right? So, Dio, concedimi la serenità di accettare le cose che non posso cambiare, il coraggio di cambiare le cose che posso e la saggezza per conoscerne la differenza. Thank you, Fabrizio, for your service.
Thank you, Silvio.
We've come to the end of this episode. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed it and would like other addicts and alcoholics to hear it, then please make the pesky AIs and algorithms work their 12th step. Hit like and subscribe. While this pod is based on the 12-Step Recovery Program, it's not officially affiliated with any 12-Step Fellowship. 12 Steps and 12 Questions is not substance or behavior specific, it's fully self-supporting and not-for-profit. And you know this next bit. It's not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization or institution. It does not wish to engage in any controversy, and it neither endorses nor opposes any causes.